On the 24th of June, 1812, the largest army Europe had ever assembled crossed a river into Russia. 6 months later, it was gone. Almost everyone believes it was destroyed by the Russian winter. The first snow fell on the 5th of November. By that date, 4 out of every 5 men were already dead, sick, or missing. This film is about the other 4 months. The Grande Armee was not beaten by cold, and it was not beaten in battle. It was beaten by lice, by bad water, by roads that turned to sand, and by the plain arithmetic of feeding 500,000 men in a country that had almost nothing left to take. Napoleon lost this campaign in July. The ribbon on this map measures one thing: the number of men still marching in Napoleon's central column. Where it is thick, the army is whole. Where it narrows, men have stopped. On the 24th of June, the ribbon crosses the Niemen at Kovno, 422,000 strong. There is no enemy in front of it. The Russian armies are withdrawing, refusing battle, and every mile the ribbon advances is a mile it takes without a fight. Watch what happens anyway. By Vilna, 4 days in, the ribbon is already thinner. By Vitebsk, in the last week of July, it has lost roughly a third of its width, and it has still not fought a general engagement. Nothing killed these men. They simply stopped being with the army, dead of fever in a wagon, or left behind at a depot, or wandered into the forest to look for food and never came back. This is the shape of the entire campaign, and it is visible before Napoleon has seen a Russian battle line. The army is not being destroyed by an enemy. It is coming apart under its own weight, in summer, in good weather, on the way in. It is worth being precise about what these missing men are, because the vagueness is how the winter story survives. They are 3 separate columns in the returns: the sick sent back to a depot and never returned to the ranks, the stragglers who fell out on the march and were absorbed into the countryside, and the dead buried where they dropped. Not one of those columns is headed enemy action. Napoleon did not underestimate the problem. He knew Russia could not feed him, so he built the largest supply operation of his life: more than 20 transport battalions, thousands of ox carts, depots stocked along the Vistula, and enough biscuit and flour on paper to carry the army for 24 days. The plan was to finish inside those 24 days, cross the Niemen, force the Russian armies to stand somewhere near the frontier, destroy them in a single battle, and dictate terms before the supply train ran dry. Everything depended on the Russians agreeing to be caught. They did not agree. The wagons had been built for the paved roads of Germany. In Lithuania, there were no paved roads. There was sand, and where there was not sand, there was bog, and after rain, the sand and the bog became the same thing. Heavy wagons sank to their axles. The columns stretched, then stalled, then fell behind the men they were meant to feed. So the horses pulled harder, on less. An army horse needs something like 20 pounds of dry fodder a day. There was no dry fodder in June. The rye was still green in the fields, and green rye gives horses colic. They ate it because there was nothing else, and they began to die in numbers nobody had planned for. On the 29th of June, 4 days into Russia, a thunderstorm broke over the marching columns, and the temperature fell through the night. Men who had been sunstruck that afternoon froze in the mud before morning. Contemporaries put the horse losses from that one storm in the thousands. It was still June. Losing horses is not a detail. Horses are how an army sees, moves, and eats. Without cavalry, Napoleon lost the ability to find the Russian armies at all. Without draft teams, guns were spiked and wagons burned. Roughly 200,000 horses died in this campaign, and every one of them subtracted something the army needed in order to work. Then there was the other thing traveling with them. In the villages of Poland and Lithuania, the army picked up body lice, and the lice carried typhus. A man sleeping in a barn with 40 other men could not avoid them. The disease has an incubation of about 2 weeks, which meant the army marched east and fell sick on a schedule. By the time the columns reached Vilna, the hospitals there were overwhelmed. Men arrived with fever, rash, and delirium, were laid down in monasteries and churches, and died at rates the surgeons recorded but could not explain. Nobody in 1812 knew what typhus was, or that the answer to it was a clean shirt. Consider where the army stood at the end of July. It had marched roughly 400 miles. It had fought no general battle. It had captured no Russian field army, and the central column had fallen from over 400,000 men to something close to 250,000. The campaign was already lost. Nobody had noticed yet. At Smolensk, in the middle of August, the Russians finally stood and then withdrew through the burning city, carrying off or destroying what was stored there. Napoleon had marched into the one place that might have resupplied him and found it on fire. He went on anyway, towards Moscow, because stopping now was an admission. This was the trap, and it was less a Russian plan than a Russian habit. Barclay de Tolly retreated because he could not win. Every mile he gave up lengthened Napoleon's supply line and shortened his own. The Russians were not defeating the Grande Armee. They were outlasting it, and they were doing it by walking away. By the first week of September, Napoleon had about 130,000 men in hand for the battle he had wanted since June. He had crossed the Niemen with more than 3 times that number. The great battle of the campaign would be fought by the survivors of the march towards it. This ribbon measures the same thing, men still with the column, and it runs the whole way from the Niemen to Moscow. Watch the width at each named place, because the numbers are the argument. At Kovno, 422,000. At Vilna, at the end of June, still over 350,000. At Vitebsk, in late July, around 280,000. At Smolensk, in the middle of August, about 175,000. At Borodino, on the 7th of September, 130,000. At Moscow, 100,000. Now look at where the ribbon loses the most. It is not at Borodino, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. It is on the open road between Vilna and Smolensk, where nothing happened at all. 3/4 of the men who left the Niemen were gone before the army reached Moscow, and only a fraction of them were killed by Russians. The rest are accounted for in hospital ledgers, in desertion returns, and in shallow graves along the Smolensk road. The winter has not started. It is September. The army is already a quarter of what crossed the river, divided by distance, and the point gets sharper still. Between Kovno and Smolensk, the column lost roughly 600 men for every mile it advanced, and it did that without being attacked. Borodino, by contrast, cost about 30,000 French casualties in one day on one field. The road was more expensive than the battle, and it charged every single day. On the 7th of September, the Russians stood at Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. Around 250,000 men fought inside an area a few miles across. The artillery fired well over 100,000 rounds in a single day. It was the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, and it settled nothing. Between them, the two armies lost roughly 70,000 men in one day. The Russians withdrew in good order. Napoleon held the field, which is the technical definition of a victory, and had destroyed neither the Russian army nor its willingness to keep retreating. He had traded a third of his remaining strength for a road. A week later, he entered Moscow. The city he had been marching towards for 11 weeks was empty. Perhaps 3/4 of the population had gone. There was no delegation, no keys, no surrender. Napoleon waited at the gate for officials who did not exist, and then rode into an empty capital. That night, the fires started. Over 4 days, they took perhaps 2/3 of the city. The governor, Rostopchin, had removed the fire pumps before he left. Whatever else Moscow might have been, it was no longer winter quarters. Napoleon had captured the objective, and the objective had burned. He stayed 5 weeks. He wrote to Alexander 3 times and was not answered once. There was nothing to negotiate because the Russians had worked out the thing Napoleon had not. They did not have to beat him. They only had to make him stand still until the arithmetic finished the job. On the 19th of October, the army left Moscow. It was not yet cold. It marched out with roughly 100,000 men and a baggage train swollen with loot, carriages full of silver, furs and church plate, pulled by horses that were already starving. Men carried candlesticks and no bread. Napoleon intended to retreat south through country the war had not touched. On the 24th of October, the Russians blocked him at Maloyaroslavets. After a day of fighting, he turned north, back onto the Smolensk road, the road he had come in on, the one his own army had already stripped bare. The first snow fell on the 5th of November. Here is the part that matters. By that date, the army which had crossed the Niemen in June was already down to a few tens of thousands of effective men. The cold did not destroy the Grande Armee. It arrived afterwards and killed what was left. The retreat down the Smolensk road is the part everyone remembers, and it is genuinely as bad as it is described. Men froze on their feet. Stragglers were killed by Cossacks and by peasants. At Smolensk, the depots held far less than promised and were emptied in hours. The army stopped being an army and became a column of individuals. At the end of November, what was left of them reached the Berezina and found the river unfrozen and the bridges gone. Engineers under General Ebel worked in the water to build 2 trestle bridges. Most of those men died of it. The fighting force got across. Thousands of stragglers did not, and the name of the river entered French as a word meaning catastrophe. On the 3rd of December, at Molodechno, he issued the 29th Bulletin. It was the first honest account Paris had been given, and it blamed the winter for all of it. It ended with a sentence that has never stopped being quoted: His Majesty's health has never been better. 2 days later, at Smorgoni, he left the army and went back to Paris in a sledge. In 2001, builders in Vilnius uncovered a mass grave holding the remains of more than 2,000 of his soldiers. 5 years later, researchers tested the dental pulp of 35 of them. Nearly a third carried the DNA of louse-borne disease, epidemic typhus or trench fever. 2 centuries on, the lice was still the evidence. This last ribbon measures survivors, and it runs the other way. It begins at Moscow on the 19th of October at 100,000 men, and it thins westward through Maloyaroslavets, Vyazma, Smolensk, Krasny, the Berezina, Molodechno, Vilna. Watch how little of it is left before the ribbon even reaches the coldest ground. By Smolensk in the middle of November, it is under 50,000. At the Berezina, at the end of November, it is perhaps 40,000 fighting men with a shapeless mass of stragglers behind them that nobody counted. When the ribbon recrosses the Niemen in the middle of December, at almost exactly the point where it started, it is worth a few thousand. Set the 2 ribbons side by side, the one going out and the one coming back, and the second is a thread. That is the whole story in a single image, and it is the reason a French engineer named Charles Minard drew this campaign in 1869 and produced what is still called the finest statistical graphic ever made. He did not need to explain it. The width does that. One more thing about this ribbon. It is the same shape whether you draw it from French returns or Russian ones, which is unusual for a campaign this contested, and it is why the argument holds. Both sides counted, both sides had reason to lie in opposite directions, and the width still agrees. So what killed the Grande Armee? Not the winter, which arrived in November to finish an army already 4/5 gone. Not the Russians, who avoided battle for 11 weeks and lost the one they fought. It was lice, green fodder, sand roads, and the distance between a hungry man and a wagon that could not reach him. Napoleon was not out-generaled, he was out-supplied.